Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. It's time for another sneak peek into the strange and alien ways of sex and ISIS, sex and the Islamic State. And this one is a really deep dive into raw material you won't see anyplace else. So I'm going to read it to you. Bear with me. You and I watched with horror and distress when Nigeria's Boko Haram took 276 schoolgirls captive, and when Boko Haram's leader, Abu Bakr Shekau, bragged on video that we will sell the girls in the market. Then came something worse. In August 2014, just a few months ago, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, now simply known as the Islamic State, attacked the town of Sinjar in the Nineveh province of Iraq. Roughly 200,000 people fled. 50,000 members of a religion few of us had ever heard of, the Yazidis, fled to Mount Sinjar, a mountain that to them was holy. Why? Because Mount Sinjar, according to local legends, was the resting place of Noah's Ark. Women and girls, press reports said, were throwing themselves from cliffs on the mountain to escape being raped and turned into sex slaves. Meanwhile, the 50,000 Yazidi refugees who didn't kill themselves were starving and dying from lack of water. After weeks of this starvation, American airplanes dropped food and water to the starving Yazidis. But the Yazidis' lives were still in immense danger. Their city, Sinjar, had been overwhelmed by ISIS forces, and they had nowhere to go. If they tried to go back home, they'd be slaughtered. Finally, Kurdish Peshmerga forces, supported by American airstrikes, opened a corridor to Turk-Kurdish territory and allowed roughly 45,000 of the 50,000 Yazidis to escape. But the real nightmare was back in Sinjar, where the triumphant Islamic State fighters demanded that the remaining 12,000 Yazidis convert to Islam, pay a tax that indicates they are part of a very, very second-class citizenry, or be murdered. According to the UN, 5,000 Yazidis were killed. Eyewitness reports said that beheadings were going on all over town, including beheadings of children. But here's the bottom line. Between 6,000 and 7,000 women and children were either jailed or handed out as sex slaves. Yes, sex slaves. 3,000 are still reportedly being held in prisons. Apparently, those 3,000 are waiting either to be killed or to be sold as sex slaves. What is this obsession with sexual slavery all about? And how did it manage to show its head in the enlightened 21st century? Sometimes it pays to get answers to questions like this from the horse's mouth. Different cultures have radically different ways of looking at the world, including totally different ideas of what's right and what's wrong. Not to mention different ideas of sex, the kind of sex the gods reward, and the kind of sex the gods punish. In the last 10 days, an extraordinary document has emerged, a real X-ray, a window into the strangeness of ISIS ways of thinking about sex. It's the 4th issue of the Islamic State's English language magazine, Dabiq. a slickly art-directed publication designed to convert you or your neighbors in the English language to the Islamic State's version of Islam and to persuade you to become a killer in ISIS holy war. In fact, it calls for you, if you're a good Muslim, to kill your neighbors in Cincinnati, in Dabiq, in London, or in Paris. One temptation in particular may appeal to you about this magazine if you are as horny as most men get between roughly the age of 12 and 30. It's an appeal of the Islamic State's militant Islam to male sexual hunger. It's the Islamic State's promise of salvation for your libido. In Dabiq, the Islamic State explains that sexual slavery and even the rape of unbelieving women is an act of justice, holiness, and even of civilization. In fact, the Islamic State's magazine implies that doing what the West has done, abandoning sexual slavery, is barbaric. Here's how the Islamic State's magazine explains and celebrates sexual slavery. This is in their own words, and their own words will do more to show you their point of view than anything I can say. The editors of Dabiq start by teasing you with a cover line, a line on the cover of the magazine. That line proudly trumpets, quote, the revival of slavery, close quote. The article inside has a slightly longer title, The Revival of Slavery Before the Hour. Now, what in the world is the hour? The hour in Islam means the coming of the resurrection and judgment day. And yes, as you'll see in a minute, the day of judgment will not come until pious believers in Islam resurrect slavery, including sexual slavery. Then there are the taglines, the lines that the editors of Dabiq hope will catch your eye. And they are indeed attention getters. Quote, we will conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women by the permission of Allah, says tagline number 1. Rome, by the way, has a double meaning. It's the city in Italy where the Pope is headquartered. We all know that. And in fact, the cover of Dabiq features a picture of the Vatican with the flag of the Islamic State flying from one of the Vatican's towers. But Rome also means all of Western Christendom in Islamic tradition. So the cover line means, we will enslave all of the women of the West. Quite an ambition. Says tagline number 2, quote, enslaving the families of the kuffar, the unbelievers, and taking their women as concubines is a firmly established aspect of the Sharia. So enslaving the women of the West is a matter of holy law, a matter of the only law code that most Muslims believe God himself has ever given to humanity. Some of the language of the article that follows is Arabic, so I've replaced the Arabic words with translations. Bear with me. For the original, Google, quote, the revival of slavery, close quote, and CopticSolidarity.org. CopticSolidarity.org is a Virginia-based group trying to defend the Coptic Christians of Egypt, a group seriously threatened by the rise of the Islamic State. That's www.CopticSolidarity.org. And the revival of slavery. Coptic Solidarity will give you a PDF of the Islamic State's Dabiq magazine, the 4th issue, this one, the one I'm reading from, in its entirety. Now for the article from Dabiq, The Revival of Slavery Before the Hour. Strap yourself in. Are you ready? Here we go. This is direct quote from Dabiq. Upon conquering the region of Sinjar in the Nineveh province of Iraq, the Islamic State faced a population of Yazidis, a pagan minority, existent for ages in regions of Syria and Iraq, Their continual existence to this day is a matter that Muslims should question, as they will be asked about it on Judgment Day. Considering that Allah had revealed the verse of the sword over 1400 years ago. Here comes the verse of the sword from chapter 9 of the Quran. Chapter 9 of the Quran says, "And when the sacred months have passed, then kill the unbelievers wherever you find them. Capture them, besiege them, sit in wait for them at every place of ambush. But if they should repent, establish prayer, and give the tax for the poor," in other words, if they convert to Islam, "let them go on their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful." The Yazidis' present-day creed, continues Dabiq, as it has changed over history, entails the worship of Satan, who they considered to be a fallen but forgiven angel amongst the angels who were ordered to prostrate to Adam. He alone, Satan, refused to prostrate to Adam, and they, the Yazidis, consider this arrogant disobedience of Allah to be Satan's noblest deed. They consider Satan to be misunderstood by mankind. They consider him to be good and enlightened. And they claim that Allah will openly forgive him on Judgment Day, after already forgiving him beforehand for crying tears of piety over a period of thousands of years. So they have made Satan, who is the biggest transgressor against Allah, the symbolic head of enlightenment and piety. What arrogant unbelief can be greater than this? Their creed is so deviant from the truth that even cross-worshiping Christians for ages considered them devil worshippers and Satanists, as is recorded in accounts of Westerners and Orientalists who encountered them or studied them. It is ultimately ironic that Obama cites these devil worshippers as the main cause for his intervention in Iraq and Syria, as he sides with the Peshmerga gangs of mercenaries related to the Marxist PUK and allied with the Marxist PKK, a, quote, terrorist organization according to the sinful laws that the West believes in. That's believes in quotes. Prior to the taking of Sinjar, Sharia students in the Islamic State were tasked to research the Yazidis, to determine if they should be treated as an originally idolatrous group or one that originated as Muslims and then apostatized, in other words, turned their back on Islam, due to many of the related Islamic rulings that would apply to the group, its individuals and their families. You see, if you're an apostate from Islam, if you've once claimed belief in Islam and have turned your back on the religion, that is an immediate death sentence. If you're only an unbeliever who's never believed in Islam, you may get off a little more lightly. Because of the Arabic terminology, because of the Arabic terminologies used by this group, the Yazidis, either to describe themselves or their beliefs, some contemporary Muslim scholars have classified them as possibly an apostate sect, not an originally idolatrous religion. But upon further research, it was determined that this group is one that existed since the pre-Islamic days of darkness, but became Islamized by the surrounding Muslim population, language, and culture, although they never accepted Islam nor claimed to have adopted it. The apparent origin of the religion is found in the Magianism of ancient Persia, but reinterpreted with elements of Sabaeanism, Judaism, and Christianity, and ultimately expressed in the heretical vocabulary of extreme Sufism. Why such a careful examination of whether these people are folks who have abandoned Islam or folks who have never believed in Islam? Because that has everything in the world to do with how you treat them or how you mistreat them. Back to the article. Accordingly, the Islamic State dealt with this group as the majority of scholars of the holy books have indicated how unbelievers should be dealt with. Unlike the Jews and Christians, there was no room for the payment of the tax demanded of subservient peoples. Also, their women could be enslaved, unlike female apostates, who the majority of the religious scholars say cannot be enslaved and can only be given an ultimatum to convert to Islam, to reconvert, or to face the sword. After capture, the Yazidi women and children were then divided according to the Sharia, according to holy law, amongst the fighters of the Islamic State, the fighters who participated in the Sinjar operations. And 1/5 of the slaves were transferred to the Islamic State's authority to be divided as the required 1/5 for the state. Well, how civilized. With between 5,000 and 7,000 people, women and children. Back to the article. This large-scale enslavement of unbelieving families is probably the first since the abandonment of this Sharia law. The magazine article is extremely proud of this fact. Again, this large-scale enslavement of unbelieving families is probably the first since the abandonment of this Sharia law. The only other known case, albeit much smaller, is that of the enslavement of Christian women and children in the Philippines and Nigeria by the makers of jihad there. The enslaved Yazidi families are now sold by the Islamic State soldiers, as the unbelievers were sold by the companions of the Prophet before them. Many well-known rulings are observed, including the prohibition of separating a mother from her young children. Many of the unbelieving women and children have willingly accepted Islam and now race to practice it with evident sincerity after their exit from the darkness of unbelief. How terrific, how wonderful. Muhammad said, quote, Allah marvels at a people who enter paradise in chains. The commentators on the holy books mentioned that this refers to people entering Islam as slaves and then entering paradise. The companion of the Prophet, Abu Huraira, said, while commenting on Allah's words, "You are the best nation produced for mankind. You are the best for people. You bring them with chains around their necks until they enter Islam." In other words, you're doing these people a favor by making them slaves. You're giving them a crack at eventually coming to believe in Islam. You're giving them a crack at the only way to get to paradise, believing in Islam. Aren't you terrific? What a wonderful humanitarian you are. If you enslave thousands, that's thousands who get to experience the possibility of paradise. What a humanitarian deed. Back to the article itself. After this discussion, and as we approach the great battle, the great slaughter, the greatest battle before the day of judgment, this is a huge Armageddon-like battle that the folks of the Islamic State believe will come immediately before the resurrection and the day of judgment. After this discussion, and as we approach the great slaughter, the greatest battle before the day of judgment, whenever its time comes by Allah's decree, it is interesting to note that slavery has been mentioned as one of the signs of the coming judgment day, as well as one of the causes behind this great battle, this great slaughter. Muhammad mentioned that one of the signs of the coming of judgment day was that, quote, the slave girl gives birth to her master. This was reported by the holy books and the Hadith. Those are the eyewitness accounts of Muhammad's life. The scholars mention a number of interpretations for this, some of them drifting away from actual slavery because it already was existent and common in their eras. The following excerpts are from commentaries indicating that actual slavery is a likely interpretation. This becomes more so the case after the abandonment of slavery, since the rise of unbelievers' sinful law and the desertion of jihad. I realize this is absolutely something you cannot follow, nor can I, but it shows you how meticulous, how careful, the folks of the Islamic State are in their scholarship to make sure that they are absolutely on the right track with this slavery, and how jubilant they are that for the first time in a long time, we are going back to the true Sharia, God's only ways of doing things, enslaving people by the thousands or even the hundreds of thousands. This will bring the day of resurrection, the day of judgment. But back to the article and some of its least comprehensible features. One commentator on the Hadith said, the scholars differed over what is meant by this. It has been stated that the conquests of the lands of the unbelievers multiply, as well as enslavement, and thereby concubines increase in numbers until the slave women give birth to their masters. This is because the child of the master has the status of the master, meaning he is a free man like his father, and thereby she has given birth to her master from this angle. It has also been stated that the slave girl gives birth to her master indicated the increased conquests of the lands of the unbelievers and the taking of slaves until a girl is taken from the land of the unbelievers at a young age, then she is freed in the land of Islam, then in other words, she becomes a Muslim and becomes free, then her mother is brought in as a slave after her, and this girl buys her mother and uses her in her service, ignorant of the fact that the slave is her mother. This has occurred in the Islamic era. This interpretation is like the one before it, indicating that one of the signs of the coming of the Judgment Day is the increased, ever-spreading conquests and bringing in of slaves from the lands of unbelief. It has also been stated that the meaning of the slave girl giving birth to her master is that people turn away from marriage sufficing with concubines alone, and Allah knows best. Another holy commentator, this is still the article, also said, this indicates the conquest of lands and the high occurrence of taking slaves until concubines and their children increase in numbers. Now, one thing to note here. If you rape a concubine, you have done a great and wonderful deed. Why? Because if she becomes pregnant, her child is automatically a Muslim, a human who has direct access to paradise. What an incredible deed you have done through rape. You'll see more of that in a minute. Back to the holy commentator. The slave girl becomes a slave to her master, while his children have the status of her master over herself. In other words, they are free and they are Muslims. How magnificent. This is because the child of the master has the rank of the master, and thereby the child of the slave girl has the status of her owner and master. Another holy scholar commented on the hadith by saying, the majority of scholars say that this foretells the increase of concubines and their children in numbers because the child of a concubine has the status of her master. Bear with the repetition here. Ibn Hajar commented on this interpretation saying, quote, but this suggested interpretation is questionable because a slave girl giving birth was an occurrence that existed in the era when the statement was made. Also, most of the conquest of the lands of sin and unbelief, the enslavement of the sinners and unbelievers' families, and the taking of the sinners and unbelievers' women as concubines occurred at the beginning of the Islamic era. Despite all this quibbling, notice a constant. The lands of Islam will rapidly grow in the immensity of their conquests, and as they do, the numbers of thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands of women and children who can be used as sex slaves will increase, and the number of babies who become Muslims because of rape will be a flood. Back to the article. Again, it appears that those who drift away from the literal interpretation of slavery do so because it was already existent and common in their era in such a manner that they found it hard to understand it as referring to actual slavery. But after the abandonment of slavery by Muslims and its subsequent revival, this literal interpretation becomes more plausible. Additionally, a hadith that one should reflect over is the long hadith of Dabiq. Dabiq, that's the town after which this magazine is named. Dabiq is supposed to be the battlefield where the ultimate battle between the Christians and the Muslims takes place, that bring in the days of resurrection and judgment. Back to the article. In the Hadith, it is mentioned that the Romans, remember that means all the Westerners of Christendom, it is mentioned that the Romans say to the Muslims after the Romans have lined up in ranks near Dabiq, "Leave us and those who were enslaved from amongst us so we can fight them." The Muslims then respond, "Nay, by Allah, we will not abandon our brothers to you." The bloody final battle, the battle that brings in the resurrection and the judgment day. The bloody final battle, it says in Dabiq, begins after this short discussion. A holy scholar commented on this hadith, saying it was reported in two forms: those who enslaved some of us and those who were enslaved from amongst us. Another scholar said those who were enslaved from amongst us is the report of the majority, and it is the correct one. Another scholar said that both of them are correct because they are enslaved first as unbelievers and then enslave the unbelievers thereafter. In other words, you take people as slaves, then they convert to Islam, and they become free, and they become, if they are males, soldier on your sides. They in turn enslave others, and those slaves in turn convert to Islam and join your armies. Very nice way of taking over the entire face of the earth. This occurrence exists in our times, says the magazine. Rather, the majority of the Islamic armies in Syria and Egypt were originally enslaved as unbelievers, and now they enslave the unbelievers. They have joined the armies of Islam. Back to the article. They have enslaved them in numerous times in our era. They enslave in just one occasion thousands of unbelievers. All praise is due to Allah for having strengthened and honored Islam. Back to the more of the article. After this, it becomes clear where the official spokesman of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria gets his inspiration from when saying, remember this is in the article, quote, "And so we promise you, O Crusaders," Christians, "by Allah's permission that this campaign will be your final campaign. It will be broken and defeated, just as all your previous campaigns were broken and defeated, except that this time we will raid you thereafter, and you will never raid us." This is addressed to all of the Christian world. Back to the article. "We will conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women by the permission of Allah the Exalted." This is his promise to us. He is glorified, and he does not fail in his promise. If we do not reach that time, then our children and grandchildren will reach it, and they will sell your sons as slaves at the slave market. The article continues. Before Satan reveals his doubts to the weak-minded and weak-hearted, one should remember that enslaving the families of the unbelievers and taking their women as concubines is a firmly established aspect of the holy law, the Sharia. That if one were to deny or mock this, he would be denying or mocking the verses of the Quran and the narrations of the Prophet, and thereby he would be apostatizing himself from Islam, which is punished by death. Back to the article. Another holy scholar said, "Successful indeed are the believers who are humble in their prayers and who shun vain conversation and who are payers of the tax for the poor and who guard their modesty, who hide their nudity, especially their sexual nudity, who guard their modesty except from their wives or the female slaves that their right hands possess." That means they guard their modesty except from their wives or from their sex slaves who they possess by rape. That is what possessing by the right hand means. For then, they are not blameworthy. But whoever craves beyond that, such are transgressors. Finally, the article says, a number of contemporary scholars have mentioned that the desertion of slavery has led to an increase in sexual sin, adultery, fornication, etc., because the holy law's alternative to marriage is not available. So a man who could not afford marriage to a free woman finds himself surrounded by temptation towards sin. Sexual slavery prevents sin. How? In addition, because if you have sexual slaves, you don't have to be horny. You don't have to rape decent Muslim women. You don't have to try to tempt the wives of other men. You can do whatever you want sexually with your slaves. Thus, you make society civilized. How wonderful. Back to the words of the article. In addition, many Muslim families who have hired maids to work at their homes face the temptation and distress of prohibited seclusion and resultant sinful sexual intercourse occurring between the man and the maid, whereas if she were his concubine, this relationship would be legal. This, again, is from the consequences of abandoning jihad and chasing after the earthly world rather than the holiness of eternity. May Allah bless this Islamic State with the revival of further aspects of the religion occurring at its hands, even beyond sexual slavery and all of its wonders and delights. Back to the article, its final sentence. And all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. In evolutionary biology, we look at groups of animals in terms of their sexual strategies. Jihadist Islam, the Islam of Boko Haram, the Islam of the Islamic State, has a sexual strategy, and it is radically different than the sexual strategy that we believe in now in the West. And we make the mistake in the West of believing that our sexual strategy is universal. It is not. But if we believe that our sexual strategy, with its prohibitions against rape, is ethically and morally correct, we will have to defend it against the jihadists, whether they be Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, whether they be Boko Haram in Nigeria, or whether they be the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, which is very blunt about the fact that it wants to take all of Western Christendom and all of Western Christendom's women. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make, or want to know why, ask how. And now for that sleazy, sinful, seditious, sneaky, impossible to discover little, there it is, it's the off button.